I think trust is hugely valuable in the legal space, right? Like, especially within PI and all forms of law, I'm sure. But people really want to feel like they can trust their attorney.
If you're listening to this, you know about podcasts, but what you might not know is how valuable they can be for your business.
Having a platform that displays both your authority on the subject that you're an expert in, displays your capacity to know what you're talking about. So not just authority, but your ability, your skill, but it also allows you to build trust over time, which I think is really valuable.
You're listening to the Personal Injury Marketing Mastermind, the show where elite personal injury attorneys and leading edge marketers give you exclusive access to growth strategies for your firm. Harry Morton creates branded podcasts for businesses across the world. His company, Lower Street, has produced hundreds of episodes across industries from technology to tourism, so he knows a thing or two about making a compelling audio. We sat down to talk shop, what podcasts bring as a marketing channel, trends in the audio world, and what separates a good episode from a great one. I'm your host, Chris Stryer, founder and CEO of Rankings.io. We help elite personal injury attorneys dominate first page rankings with search engine optimization. Being at the forefront of marketing is all about understanding people. So let's get to know our guest. Here's Harry Morton, founder and CEO of Lower Street.
I finished university and went to work in audio post-production. So I was working for a company that did a lot of big ad campaigns for the big agencies in London. So I was kind of living that central London life, earning very little money and waking up at, you were the first one in the studio in the morning and the last one to leave at night and earning the least, and kind of did the hard yards there. And I did that for a couple of years and, learned a lot about working in marketing, working in advertising, but also I learned that I did not like that environment. It was super stressful and just kind of not as rewarding as I'd kind of, you come out of school as this sort of aspiring musician, creative person, and then you're thrust into sort of pretty fast paced ad agency world. And that wasn't quite my scene. So I quit that and ended up traveling a bunch. And through that experience, did a load of sales and marketing roles. From about 2012, was listening to podcasts and it was my main kind of medium of consuming information, because I knew that whole time that I wanted to start my own thing. I just didn't know what that would look like. And it was sort of through that process of listening to a bunch of different business podcasts, from Tim Ferriss to Seth Godin to, whoever else, that I realized that, the answer was staring me in the face, and it was podcasting. That's kind of, what I knew audio and that was the opportunity for me. So that kind of led to me quitting my sales and marketing job and setting out on the sort of journey to build an agency. And it's been awesome. I guess it's funny, you start off, at least in my experience, I started a business with a fair amount of kind of, certainly naivety and a fair bit of ego as well. Because, I came from the audio background and I looked at the landscape of people running podcast agencies and thought, I can do better than that. Like they're not so good. I can do better. And so sort of jumped into it feet first. But luckily for me, it's kind of panned out okay.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we're a very happy client of yours. The Rankings podcast uses your company, Lower Street. And we're going to really dive in that in a moment. But your story reminds me a lot of the E-Myth, the Michael Gerber, the technician. Then they're like, oh, I can do it better. I mean, that's right. I think that's the story of a lot of entrepreneurs. And I appreciate that. And I think that's a neat trajectory that everything kind of aligns, sales and marketing, your audio.
Coming from that angle, the constant battle you're facing then is trying to get yourself out of doing all of the work, right? Because it's your expertise. It's why you started that business. And so suddenly it becomes harder to sort of, remove yourself from being that expert on the ground, right? And instead of kind of managing and growing and strategy and so on. Absolutely.
And I think that's a struggle that many of us have, just many business owners. One of the things I wanted to talk about is Lower Street's already been, remote through the entire pandemic. And you've hosted over 150 episodes in the podcast called Work From Home. Are there any tips for those who have transitioned to working from home? Some things that have really helped you succeed in that area?
Yeah. So we started that podcast we ran it all through 2020 as kind of a response to the pandemic, because, we're a remote team already. So we kind of felt like we had some stuff to chat about there, and it was something we were really interested in. The themes that came out of it mostly were just around the kind of psychological side of it, rather than like get this chair or this piece of software and you'll be set. I think it was just so much more around like, taking care of yourself, essentially. I think what we saw, like loads of people doing, was actually working more as a result of working from home rather than less. The kind of dream that everyone has in their mind of, I'm going to work from home and I can put my feet up and it's going to be great. There's no commute. But actually what people were doing was just working a ton more. And it's actually much harder to switch off because of that. So basically the best advice I have is go for more walks, give yourself more breaks. I mean, give yourself a break literally and give yourself a break figuratively as well. I think a lot of people put a lot of pressure on themselves to kind of do that stuff. So yeah, that would be it. Time away from the computer is as productive as time in front of it as we see it. And removing distractions as well. Like I live in a house with a toddler and a baby, so it's not so easy to remove distractions. There can be lots of those at home.
One of the things that I just realized when you're speaking about this is when I was working from home, now I'm back in our commercial space, but when I was working from home, our master bedroom's on the same floor as our office. So it's like roll out of the bed, get ready, and you're at work. Right. And I just always felt like I was at work. And before I met my wife, I didn't even sleep in the master bedroom. I slept downstairs because in the smaller room, because it felt like I was off work when I went downstairs into the basement. Mm-hmm. It was like an easy transition to like flip the switch in the mind. I don't know what it actually really worked. And that's part of the reason why I like coming to the office. Is like, okay, I'm going to the office to work. Now, when I go home, I'm off work.
Absolutely. There's this concept of the third space that was kind of written about by this Australian author who I've forgotten the name of. So I'll make sure that our writers put it in the show notes. But he basically did a ton of research about this. And it's the idea of the third space, that being the space between work and home. So that you have that kind of like, even if it's a 2-minute thing. And so what he recommended is that literally you finish work, you walk out the front door, you walk around the block for 2 minutes, come back in the house, and it just allows that kind of reset, kind of like what you're saying, right? Like if your work is upstairs and your home is downstairs, you kind of have that mental switch. So I think even if we don't have the commute, the kind of virtual commute is kind of really important too.
Super smart. I like that a lot. So let's dive right into your expertise. Let's dive right into branded podcasts, and you have so much to offer here, and I'm really excited about this. Let's start with the basics. What can a podcast do for your business that you can't get from other mediums?
Yeah. So I think what podcasting does best is we see levels of engagement that you just don't see in any other media. I think, if we look at the statistics behind, and we spend a lot of time nerding out on this stuff, behind the kind of consumption of a podcast, let's say a 30-minute podcast, we're commonly seeing 80, 85, 90% completion rates, meaning the average listener is listening to 90% of that content of a 30-minute episode. That's a period of time that you're spending with your customer, with your client, with your prospect, that you just can't get anywhere else. So if you for example, we compare that to social, you'll be really hard pressed to get, the average person to listen to more than 5, 10, maybe % of a video that you put out on social or, a post or whatever. Email open rates, anything above 50% is a really great rate. And so to be able to consistently week over week, spend 30 minutes of your time with the people that you're trying to reach is really powerful. And I guess the other side is the level of authenticity. It's a very intimate medium, right? We sit here with headphones on. It's kind of a one-to-one medium rather than standing on a stage where you're talking to 1,000 people at once. It feels like it's kind of one-to-one. And so that level of relationship you can build with your audience is super powerful. So yeah, that's what we see.
We're over 70 episodes now, and I never thought of it like that. I can't imagine if I was trying to hold someone's attention on YouTube. Right. Like, what would I have to do to keep them for 30 minutes on a consistent basis? Whereas podcasts, it's, individuals probably listen to the whole episode every time.
Exactly. Right. And that's partly because of what you're used to. It's the habit you're used to listening to podcasts, but it's also because you can listen while you're driving or walking the dog or doing the dishes or whatever. So it can be something you're doing when your hands are busy,
Yeah. So let's talk about how do podcasts fit into an overall marketing strategy, like an overall larger marketing strategy for a business?
Sure. So I think where we see podcasts is they're very much a top of funnel thing. We're talking about the marketing funnel. It's a very early stage piece of that funnel. I mean, you can, of course, optimize your show to serve whatever purpose you want. But generally speaking, the reason that it's very powerful is you're able to build that trust with your audience. And so it might be that you're putting out content, and in your case, it's about SEO. You can put out really valuable content on SEO, and your ideal buyer might be out there listening to this right now, and they're not ready today, but they're ready in 6 months, a year's time. But during that period of listening to you talk about what you know best, they've built an incredible amount of trust in you. So I think that's where podcasting is really valuable. I think we also see a lot of value right down at the beyond the funnel, actually, and your existing clients. I think in terms of kind of educating your customers, maybe less so in the sort of services space, the agency space that you and I are in, but the kind of SaaS space, the software space, I think a lot of times customers can be educated on how to be successful with their tools. And that can be a really great way to kind of continue that relationship beyond the point of them kind of making a purchase decision. So that's where I see podcasting. It's really great right at the beginning, and it's really great at retaining people and keeping them on into the future.
So kind of like that more
Exactly.
on that end. I guess it hits even the trust aspect too, the know, like, and trust.
Because it's so personal. Like, I think listeners of this show will feel that they have a really good understanding of who you are as a person, Chris. And I think that's a super powerful thing.
Absolutely. And, one other thing that I heard recently that was kind of surprising, but it doesn't make sense, is the income, the overall average income of someone that listens to a podcast is significantly higher. Have you heard of any statistics or anything related to the general audience of those that listen to podcasts?
Yeah, you're right. So the archetypal podcast listener, and that's changing all the time, right? Because, for example, Spotify are making a huge amount of noise in the podcast space right now, and they have just an enormous kind of footprint globally, and that's really changing the landscape of podcasting, actually. But the core kind of base of podcasting is really built around people that are well-educated, university education and beyond, as you mentioned, kind of higher earners. It very slightly skews male, but I think that's changing all the time. And it's biggest in, the biggest markets are in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, those kind of places. So in terms of that kind of B2B play, it's a great medium that is listened to by the right folks, at least for most businesses.
Having launched dozens of shows, Harry has seen what it takes to get a podcast off the ground. I asked him his advice for businesses that are thinking about venturing into the world of podcasts.
The first and most important thing is really to think about why you're making a podcast. Because I think a lot of people come to us and they say, we've got this great idea for a show. We're really excited. We're going to build a huge audience and it's going to be great. And I think what they quite often do is will come to me with a concept. And so they've got this idea. We're going to speak to X group of people about this topic. And this is how we're going to be, this is why the show's going to be great. I think where we see the most success is when people actually think about instead, what is the business objective I have here? What am I trying to achieve? Who am I trying to reach? So who's our target buyer or prospect or whatever that we want to be our audience? And what do they need right now that we can offer? Because rather than coming at it from, here's the show I've got this idea for, how do I find the listeners that I want to listen to it? We prefer to go the other way and say, here are the listeners. Here's what you have to offer. How can we build something that kind of meets their needs? So like, what shows are they already listening to? What other podcasts are already serving that vertical? Where are their gaps and how can we make something unique? Because, we're in a world where there's 2 million podcasts in existence. So there's no shortage of choice. So we need to make sure that we're actually offering something genuinely unique and differentiated. And the other thing I would say is that while it's incredibly important to come out of the gate sounding good and, because you want to represent yourself properly in this medium, getting started is just the most important thing. If you're a DIY podcaster or you're considering starting podcasting, start now, because, the old cliche, the best time to start a podcast was 10 years ago, but the second best time is today. So just get started, because it will take a while to kind of seed that listenership. And so, the effect over time will certainly compound. So yeah, get started.
I love that piece of advice. And I want to talk about the opposite end of this just briefly before we talk about some more advantages and things. Where do you see just some of the most common issues? Where do companies go wrong with their show typically?
I think it's just in not doing enough preparation. I think a lot of folks come into podcasting and go, cool, I'm in blockchain technology. I've got this great idea. I'm going to interview blockchain technologists and we're just going to put that out and that's going to be great. And doubtless there will be some value there. But I think what would really benefit most podcasters is to spend just a lot more time preparing that, not just the concept of what the show is going to be, but also preparing for each individual episode. Because rather than just sitting down with someone and hoping that you have an engaging conversation, really spending the time to think about what unique value does this person have to offer and how can we dig that out of them? I think that's where we see mistakes being made, is just people kind of basically doing, the easy route, right? Just kind of going, cool, these are the guests. We'll sit down, we'll record them for an hour and it'll be great. The truth is, great shows take more work than that is the truth of it.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I love working with your company, because your company does a lot of that guest research, really preps the excellent questions, so I've got to do my own research. And I asked you before this, I was like, well, did you cheat? Did you look at the research notes? And we were talking about having this, genuine kind of live conversation. But I found even in a previous episode where I talked to Jordan Harbinger, he was like, one of the best things that I do is a tremendous amount of research on the front end. He even reads the book typically of an author, and it leads to a better type of conversation because you can really speak to them in a more authentic way.
In an authentic way, also a way that specifically applies to your audience, because everyone's audience is different. And so you're not just kind of asking generic stuff, you're asking stuff that's really interesting to them. Also, you're offering questions that haven't been asked before because you can check out other podcasts they've been on and things like that. And rather than going through the same kind of thing, so, how did you get into X, Y, and Z? You can actually, really try and ask unique questions that haven't been sort of talked about before.
Yeah, absolutely. And just briefly, rankings is all about SEO. So I just want to talk about a couple, what are some of the SEO benefits of a podcast, and how can you repurpose your content to improve your SEO?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I think podcasting, you're getting really rich content here. You're having a conversation with subject matter experts who can really, offer a really high level of value. And for that to only exist in audio form is kind of a waste of that. I think it's a perfect kind of piece of content to repurpose into other formats. And of course, that lends itself to writing articles, blog posts, even transcripts. I mean, you tell me you're the podcasting expert, the SEO expert, but, transcripts, now that Google can start to crawl audio, the value of transcripts, I don't know. I find that really interesting, that debate. But nevertheless, I think having a written version of your audio content is just a complete no-brainer. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of kind of SEO value in podcasting. And I think, as I've sort of said, Google are crawling audio. I think as that continues to become more of a thing and Google is serving audio results as part of their, in the SERPs, I think that will start to become a really interesting space. So yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the things I've noticed is if you're a guest on like a webinar or a YouTube show, a lot of times they don't do a transcript, but almost all podcasts do a transcript, and they almost always link back to the guest.
Yes.
So it's a great way to obtain backlinks. You just get on somebody's show and have a good conversation. The other thing that I noticed too was, the transcripts themselves, like maybe they don't rank the best for SEO for those really high intent phrases, but it gives the guests something to link back to because they typically don't share the Apple link. They'll link back to the transcript.
Right.
And, we had Seth Godin on several episodes ago, and I was shocked. I jumped into my Ahrefs and I was like, oh, we got a link from Seth. And that's what he did. He linked back to the transcript.
Incredible. I mean, yeah, that's huge value.
Yeah. We obviously come at marketing from a legal perspective, and we found a lot of success in this podcast. Why do you think podcasts work so well for the legal industry specifically?
Yeah, well, I mentioned podcasting as a trust thing, right? Because we really get to know the host of a show over time. I think trust is hugely valuable in the legal space, right? Like, especially within PI and all forms of law, I'm sure. But people really want to feel like they can trust their attorney. And I think that having a platform that displays both your authority on the subject that you're an expert in, displays your kind of capacity to know what you're talking about. So not just authority, but sort of your ability, your skill, but it also allows you to build trust over time, which I think is really valuable. The other thing actually specifically to law firms that I think we've seen some really great success with is that the podcast can be a great way to feature as guests or to have as your audience ideal referral partners. A lot of firms have found that just by starting new relationships with potential referral partners, just by literally asking them to be on the show as their guest, has been really powerful for them.
Yeah, I love that aspect because, the legal environment's really fractured by geography or practice area. And it's a way to kind of get your foot in the door to these other states, other great trial attorneys and other locations, just have them on the podcast, build a relationship.
Definitely. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Lower Street. I want to talk about what you guys do. And I just have to share from my perspective, it was just a way to elevate and improve our podcast. I love the voiceovers, the research you guys do, but it's kind of given me our audience who may not have heard about Lower Street, what you guys do and how you help individuals with their podcast.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, thank you for asking. Really, we're podcasting nerds. It's all we do. So we can help really with any aspect of show creation, whether that be from developing a concept for a new show. As I mentioned, so much of the focus is on, what are we trying to achieve with this show as a business rather than let's just make a thing. Let's try and make sure that this podcast delivers on stuff. So really kind of formulating strategy around a show, through the production process. And as you mentioned, we're really interested in doing great shows, not good shows. And so that involves a lot of back end work. So our producers will research and write prep sheets for our hosts so that they can go into those interviews, fully prepared and researched. We can help with kind of scripting and all that kind of good stuff. So really trying to make the best shows possible. And then we can help on the back end in terms of distribution and promotion and kind of growing that audience after the fact. So yeah, that's what we're all about. And we work exclusively with brands. So we don't kind of, we work much less with folks that are using the podcast to monetize. We're really interested in working with businesses and how they can leverage it for their marketing.
Plenty of people have already drank the podcast Kool-Aid, but with more players entering the space, you've got to make your show really stand out. So I asked Harry, what does it take to take your podcast to the next level?
You sort of talked about narration, and we've kind of spoken briefly about the fact that some folks will just kind of sit down in front of a mic, record a conversation for an hour, maybe edit out a couple of ums and ers and call it good, put it out. I'm not saying there's no value to that content. That can be absolutely great. And indeed, I listen to lots of those shows. But I think where we really can start to set shows apart is doing the hard work for the listener. And what that looks like is maybe not playing the entire episode unabridged with a couple of, short edits. It's actually saying, where are the core kind of bits of vital information here? Let's reduce it to just those and then link that together with narration so that we can fill any gaps for the listener. So for example, if I waffle on with a boring story about my childhood, instead of forcing the listener to listen to 15 minutes of me ramble on about my grandmother, you could instead say in 5 seconds of narration script, Harry grew up in the southwest of England and he chose to go down this path and so on. And so we're doing that hard work for the listener and making sure that they're getting, an incredibly punchy, high value, let's say 30-minute episode rather than a kind of more meandering hour-long episode, which will contain the same value, but much less likely to get as many people listen to it as you would on the kind of more condensed version. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got another question that I've just always thought about is the release cadence.
Yep.
The weekly show, the daily show, the twice a week, I guess that you can succeed in a variety of different manners, but typically where do you see the most success? Is it release on a Monday? Is it release on a Friday?
So yeah, we're really talking kind of hacking on that front. Data shows that the biggest download days for podcasts are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we typically recommend that folks release their episodes on those days. Tuesday's our favorite day because then you're at the beginning of that kind of wave. I think we're splitting hairs there though. If you already release on a Monday, that's not a reason to change it. I think the biggest thing is consistency. You talked about kind of consistency before, I think, and putting the work in over time, working for those 70 episodes that you've done. That's when the dividends really start to pay off. And it's, setting that expectation with your listener, the Rankings podcast is going to be here every week. When to expect it. And that's a really important thing. So some clients say to us, we want to release a show every month because we don't think we can manage any more than that. I recommend that the month is too infrequent because folks just forget the show exists basically in between episodes. You want to really create that habit in our listeners. But we see every 2 weeks and every week being, equally effective. The final thing I'll say, rather than waffling on for too long, is that if you feel like every 2 weeks is too much, you don't feel like you could pull it off. What we recommend doing instead is saying, okay, cool. Well, let's take those 12 episodes you would have done over this calendar year on a monthly basis and put that out as a season. And so release those as weekly episodes for a season and then just do that for a quarter and then take 6 months, 9 months off, whatever works for you. Because you will get much, much more feedback, much more engagement, much more value from that if you do it within, on that weekly cadence and then just take a break. So that would be my kind of advice on that one.
Yeah, I think that's super smart. And I originally tried to do 2 a week. And what I found just from a personal level is it's really hard to promote 2.
Right.
I really want to give the guests the full attention and really appreciate them for coming on the show. And if I do like a Tuesday, Thursday, it just seems like one of them is discredited.
Right. And also you're missing out on a bit of opportunity for that. We talked about repurposing the content. If you've only got 2 days to kind of do your social stuff and your blog posts and you're not really giving it the full dues, I think, multiple times a week works for shows that are maybe shorter form. So let's say you had a 15-minute show that might not even be an interview show. It's just kind of, you're making shorter form content, then multiple times a week works really well. But like you say, if you've got a guest and you really want to sort of, respect the value that they're offering the audience, you need to give it a decent amount of airtime. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Absolutely. So a couple final questions here, Harry. So, where do you see the audio industry going in the next couple of years?
Well, I think it's a really exciting time. There is a lot of a lot of change and a lot of investment in the space. So Spotify have been spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a bunch of acquisitions around the podcasting. They're really betting heavily on podcasting's growth. Apple Podcasts have come up with a slate of announcements recently that are making lots of changes, and Apple has been the sort of leader in the podcasting space to this point. And so they're kind of, restating their claim and kind of helping to move the medium forward. And then lots of other players are entering also. So I think there's a lot of activity here, and all of that kind of investment and, the advertising revenue for the industry is set to hit $2 billion for 2022. They're expecting $2 billion in advertising revenue in the space. So it's becoming a really legitimate industry. And I think that means that's great for us that are in the podcasting industry. That's great for us as businesses that are leveraging podcasts. But what it also means is that more people talking about it, more awareness of it means that the listenership is going up as well. So it's growing the pie. So if you're reticent to get into podcasting, you think all shows have been done. Well, the good news is actually, firstly, that's not true. And secondly, listenership is growing all the time. And so I think it's a really exciting time to be in podcasting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when I think of the competition versus other mediums, other channels, and what you have to do to stand out and compared to podcasting, I still think we're in those early adoption type days.
Completely agree. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. I think if you start a YouTube channel, you've got a really hard battle to kind of fight the crowd there. Whereas in podcasting, there's still a lot of open space.
Absolutely. So you listen to a lot of podcasts, you're involved in a lot of them. What are some of the podcasts our guests, mostly personal injury attorneys, should be listening to?
Well, one that I must give you had Seth Godin on the show a while ago. I'm a big fan of Seth and everything he puts out is awesome. So Akimbo, AKIMBO, is one that I listen to all the time and highly recommend. There are a bunch of business podcasts I could talk about, but maybe not interesting to everybody. So I think I want to give some non-business recommendations so that folks can just listen to a really great piece of podcasting art from across the pond as well. So I should be clear, this is one question I prepared for because I thought I'd probably get asked it. So West Cork is a podcast about an Irish murder case from the 90s. Absolutely awesome show, really gripping if you're into your true crime stuff. And another one is The Missing Crypto Queen, which was a UK production all about this really shady character who invented a cryptocurrency. And I don't want to give any spoilers. It's an amazing story. If you've got some time while you're driving or doing the dishes, I would recommend listening to that.
Thanks for those recommendations. And final question here, what's next for Lower Street?
More growth, basically. I talked about the growth in the podcasting industry. We've been incredibly lucky to be in a good place at a good time. And so we doubled in size through 2020. And so, really, I'm just focused on scaling the team right now. We're onboarding 2 new producers are joining the team as we speak. And we've got 2 more coming. So really, it's just about kind of growing the team to serve our clients and just produce better and better shows. That's really all we're interested in is just honing the craft and being the best production company out there.
As a client, I've obviously bought into what Harry is doing. There's so much value to be had in a well-made podcast. You create content, establish trust, generate backlinks, establish relationships. And like Harry said, if you don't have one yet, the best time to start is now. I'd like to thank Harry Morton from Lower Street for sharing his story with us, and I hope you gained some valuable insights from the conversation. You've been listening to the Personal Injury Marketing Mastermind. I'm Chris Dreyer. If you like this episode, leave us a review. We'd love to hear from our listeners. I'll catch you on next week's PIM with another incredible guest and all the strategies you need to master personal injury marketing.